Okay. As always, there's always something, right, going on. And so I want to welcome everybody to this discussion of Arnie Richards' forthcoming memoir called Unorthodox: My Life in and Outside Psychoanalysis. And I am the co-organizer and moderator, and will keep time as things go on. There may be one adjustment to the schedule. Arnie may not speak as long as he's allotted for, and then we'll move everything up and save more time at the end for questions from the audience. But first, what I need to do is thank a couple of people. My co-organizer, Dr. Ina Rosensvedt, who you'll see on the screen from time to time, and Paul Elovitz, whose Psychohistory Forum is sponsoring this event. So the way things will work is Arnie will speak for a half hour or so. Then each of the 7 presenters will speak. Then there will be a discussion between Arnie and the presenters. And there'll be a couple of breaks in here as well. And then after that, we will have questions from the 146 people who have signed up. They all have to ask. No. So, Arnie Richards.
Thank you very much. I am honored. I'm thrilled to be invited. I'm thankful to Paul and to Ken and to Ina for this opportunity. This is the first opportunity I will have to talk about my memoir. Writing a memoir is a very interesting experience. For me, it's been like a second analysis, thinking about myself. And I'm particularly thinking about who I am and how I got to be who I am. And because there's a lot of puzzlement in my life about how I went from the beginning to now. So the memoir really has to do, and what I'm going to talk about today, it has to do with my professional life, my organizational life, and my personal life. And those 3 are connected, are intertwined. For example, often I like to say that the political is personal and the organizational is personal. And they can't be separated each from each other. Now, it's interesting in terms of today because the meeting of the American just ended yesterday, and we had a book table there. We had 250 books, and that was very gratifying because, for example, Routledge is no longer selling books at the meeting. And we sold 79 books, not as many, I think, as the last time we were there. And we broke even. But what was interesting to me, the #1 seller was Frank Sinatra by Harvey Kaplan. And the second most seller was Jane Austen by Margaret Ann Hanley. And the point I want to make is that people are not reading, and they're also not writing. They're not reading analytic books, and they're not writing analytic papers. And I know for a fact that the analytic journals, this is becoming problematic. And what we've seen is that we sell more novels and books of poetry and memoir. And so I think that's something for us to think about in regard to the status of psychoanalysis in the United States and, of course, in the rest of the world. It is, and we have to wonder why people are not interested in writing, certainly not interested in writing about psychoanalytic theory, as I have done for many, many years. Yeah, I had another thought about speaking less, but my editor, I had my editor interview my children to see what they can remember about me. And I was shocked that our son told him that he remembered me as a child not saying very much. I couldn't understand how that could be, but he insisted that was the case. I think it was probably because I was involved in analytic training for those years. And as all of us know, analytic training becomes a major commitment, and often your family gets pushed to the side. So maybe I should start at the beginning. I was born in 1934. It was the worst of times, as many of you know. It was the depth of the Depression, and it was at the depth of the Depression, and it was the height of the Dust Bowl, and things were not very good. I remember as a child reading A Tale of Two Cities. Remember that? It begins, it's the best of times and the worst of times. And so what comes to my mind now is that it was the worst of times. It was certainly not the best of times, although in some ways it was a very good time for me because of my position in the family and how I was viewed. But anyway, as a matter of fact, I had a complete set of Charles Dickens growing up, a complete set of Sholem Aleichem, and a complete set of the Book of Knowledge, which I read cover to cover. Literally, I read every page of the Book of Knowledge, which was helped me a lot in taking multiple choice examinations. So in my memoir, of course, I mentioned how I almost it was the depth of my depression. My mother had my sister. She still owed the obstetrician money, and when she became pregnant with me, she wanted to have an abortion, but her brother convinced her not to, saying that who knows, I might turn out to being something something special. So she didn't get aborted, and then she got the money to pay for the obstetrician from two spinster sisters who didn't have children, and gave her $50 so she would name me after their father. So that's how I got the name Arnold. There's no Arnold in my family. There's no Aharon in my family, but that was this person who I never met, who didn't know. My middle name was David, which was my uncle, my father's brother, a younger brother, who was killed by Petlura's men in the Ukraine in the 1918, and they were looking for my father. He was wearing my father's hat, and they killed him. And so then I became David. My father wasn't that happy that I wasn't David Arnold rather than, Arnold David, but that's the story. The story of my life, of my father's life, is interesting because he was a Bolshevik, and he joined the revolution in 1917. He was part of Trotsky's Red Army. In fact, he was in charge of the cart that carried the books for the soldiers. Not that they could read. He had gone to gymnasium, so he could read. And so, of course, I've thought that my interest, in publishing books comes from that connection to my father, who was known as, I call Mendele Machasporum. I don't know if you know that. That's, I guess, the Sholem Aleichem character, Mendel the bookseller. And of course, you're all aware that I am very much the bookseller. Now, my earliest lexical memory, and that must have been, it was in November 1939. I remember reading in the Yiddish Forward or seeing a picture of this man with a beard, and I could read Yiddish at that time, and it said, in Yiddish, a berühmter Psychiater gestorben, a famous psychiatrist died, and it had to do with the death of Sigmund Freud. Later on, I went and I got that issue of the Forward, and I found the picture, and sure enough, it was there. And the headline of the Forward was Varsha in Flammen, Warsaw in Flames, and it was when the Germans bombed Warsaw. Now one can what connection that original picture of Freud have to do with my becoming a psychoanalyst? But I said this in my memoir. To become a psychoanalyst was something that was something I was interested in early on. In fact, sometimes I refer to myself as a lay analyst, following Martin Bergman's definition of a lay analyst. A lay analyst is someone who goes into a profession to become an analyst, not to become a psychologist, a social worker, a physician, but to become a psychoanalyst. And so, that was the case. Hold on, I don't know. Hold on for a minute. Sorry for a minute. But anyway, and even though, my sense was that I always wanted to become a psychoanalyst. And a crucial experience in that regard, and this had to do with a decision I made, or a choice that was made or made for me. And the first, kind of, what would have been was that I went to Erasmus Hall High School rather than New Utrecht. Erasmus was a much better school than New Utrecht. And the way I got to Erasmus was that in 1948, I went to Camp Wilmette. I came back with polio. I got polio. I was, in New York State Hospital and Rehabilitation Hospital. And my mother went to the Board of Education and told them that it would be better to go to Erasmus. I could take the Caton Avenue bus. To go to New Utrecht, I have to climb up the stairs to the West End elevated, and they bought the story, and so I got to Erasmus. The people I met at Erasmus, and the intellectual connections that I made were very, very important. And I'm not sure that would have happened in New Utrecht. There were three people that we was very close to: Marty Willock, Stanley Palumbo, and Bennett Simon. And they all became psychoanalysts. And so that was certainly very, very important. Marty is no longer with us. Bennett was also, lived in Borough Park, but he got to go to Erasmus because he wanted to take Greek. As a matter, I remember I said that if I couldn't get in that way, I would take Greek, and that's how I would go to Erasmus. So those high school years were very important to me in terms of my interests and my cultural development. When I was 14 years old, I read Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And during the next 3 or 4 years, I happened to be an Orthodox Jew, but at the same time, I read James Joyce and Ezra Pound and Kenneth Patchen and Delmore Schwartz and Thomas Wolfe and so forth. And that was part of my part of this community that we had at high school. I would say probably unusual for that generation. And I spent my every Saturday I would go to the Brooklyn Public Library and read books. And to me, it's still puzzling Where did that interest come from? I have a memory of going to the Brooklyn Public Library and taking out a book by Chalene. How did I hear about him as a writer? But I did. That was, so going to Erasmus rather than the Utrecht was very important. And the next important event was where to go to college. I applied to many schools, including Harvard and Cornell. I got into Harvard and Cornell, but my family couldn't afford for me to go to Harvard. So I went to Brooklyn College instead. That is, and to me, I still wonder, how was it that my family wasn't aware, that Harvard was prestigious and they should do whatever they can, to make me go there. But I did. I remember I went to Brooklyn College, and I came home that evening, and there was a letter from the University of Chicago, because giving me a full tuition and full room and board scholarship to the University of Chicago. And of course I went, and that was another, choice that had consequences. I'm quite certain that I did better going to the U of C, being taught by some of the, intellectual greats, and rather than going to Harvard and being taught by graduate students. Marty Willick, Stanley Palumbo, Bennett Simon all went to Harvard. I went to the U of C. And of course, the other fortuitous thing about the U of C was that Arlene also went to the U of C. She didn't graduate from high school. She went when she was 16 years old. I was 17. And we connected there, and that's a whole other history of what followed. The system was that it was 3.5 years of required courses. You took all the courses to begin with, and you only took the ones that you placed out of. I placed out of everything. There were 4 of us that did, me, Howie Kremen, Ernie Hartman, Heinz Hartman's son, and a woman named Neva Van Pesky. But you had to take 4 courses, because you couldn't graduate before you started. So I did. But in retrospect, I think I lost out by leaving the college so soon. I think I would have benefited from taking more courses, in the college. But instead, I went into the Division of Biological Sciences and biological sciences and took pre-med courses, because you couldn't apply to medical school until you were, old enough. And so I did that. So the next, so I say decision point was where to go to medical school. I was accepted at the University of Chicago Medical School, and the issue was the same. We were married then. We couldn't afford, to go to the U of C. So I decided before to apply to downstate in Brooklyn. And that summer before I started, I took the entrance exam, for medical school, and I got a scholarship and went to downstate, which, in retrospect, was not a very look. As a medical school, it was very different from Chicago. I think if I'd gone to Chicago, I would have been more interested in research and academic medicine and less in clinical medicine. And I'm not sure whether or not I would have become a psychoanalyst if I had gone to the University of Chicago. So the next decision after medical school was residency. And there were 2 central possibilities. Well, actually, as I remember, I did apply to Mass Mental Health. I was interviewed by SEMRAD and Sam Bogosh, and I was rejected. By the way, also in terms of medical school, my college dorm mate's father was the director of admissions of Columbia PNS. And he told me, don't bother applying to Columbia PNS because they have a quota for Jews and you would never get admitted. So I didn't apply to Columbia. But so, I applied to Chicago and then downstate. So the next issue was where to go for residency. The two possibilities were Topeka, the Medical School of Psychiatry, and Albert Einstein. Now, most of the people that I knew actually from medical school, like Marty Willick and so forth, they all went to Albert Einstein. And I applied to Albert Einstein, and I was accepted. And Arlene and I decided that we did not want to live in a basement in the Bronx, that we would be better off going to Topeka where we could have a house and we had children already and it would be a much pleasanter environment. And so I turned them down, and I remember, getting a call from Jose Barchelon saying, no, Richards, are you coming? And I said, no, I'm going to Topeka. Several years later, I met him in Denver, and he told me I had made a mistake by not going to Milt Rosenbaum's program at Einstein. But I don't think he was correct. Topeka was an incredible place. One of the things they had was Alfred P. Sloan visiting professors, and where we came for a month, and all the residents, spent time with him. Conrad Lorenz, Aldous Huxley, Margaret Mead, Hayakawa, Fred Hacker. It was a very special place. Carl Menninger was a very special psychiatrist who promoted or championed the anti-nosological, Zosian approach to psychiatry, which I think has served me very well in my whole career. And the other very important, serendipitous aspect was that while I was a resident, for my second and third year, I had a commission in the public health service, which paid very nicely. In fact, I had 2.5 stripes. I guess that's what, a lieutenant commander, which made all the difference in terms of the way we lived. The deal was, this was a program that was worked out by Carl Menninger and James Bennett. The prison service had money for psychiatrists, but no psychiatrists. So they set up this program where you would be in the public health for 4 years, 2 years doing your residency, and then 2 years in a prison. And you, unlike having to spend 4 years, in the military in the Berry plan. So that was that also worked out very well. And then I went to, we went to Petersburg, Virginia. I was the chief medical officer and the chief psychiatrist at the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. And that was a very interesting experience. Not only being in the prison, what was most important was that was the height of the civil rights movement in the South. And we were very much involved in that. We started an integrated art show. I joined the Southern Christian Leadership Committee. I met Abernathy, not King. Arlene marched on Washington. I couldn't because I was in the military service and you aren't allowed. And it was a very, very exciting time. Conflicted, difficult, but it was an experience. And during those 2 years, one of the things that happened in the prison when I was there, Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General. And during my first year, he decided to integrate the prisons. And so the prisons were integrated in one day. It was quite remarkable. And the staff followed, without dropping a beat. But obviously, some of them were not very happy. I also have a memory of the day that Kennedy was shot, and being in the laboratory, and some of the inmates cheered. So that was my service. And it fulfilled my military service. Internship was not very memorable, but then when I finished at Topeka, the next decision was was analytic training. I applied to 3 institutes: the Washington Institute, in the District of Columbia, in DC, Washington, the New York Psychoanalytic, and Columbia. Washington was an interesting experience. I was interviewed by a group. I think there was Dan Jaffe, Edith Weiger, Don Noble, and Harold Searles. And I remember the interview very well because Harold Searles said to me, I see you were working in a prison. Was your childhood a prison? And so I said I wasn't sure about that. And I was accepted, but I decided not to go to Washington. I was also accepted at Columbia, and had 3 interviews. I was very unimpressed with the 3 people who interviewed me, and then I applied to, and then I was interviewed by 3 people in New York: Bernie Fine, Andrew Petto, and Lily Bissell. After I saw Bernie Fine, I had a dream. And in the dream, someone said to me, "That's fine." So I told Petto this dream. Of course, he decided I had access to my unconscious. And so he thought I should be admitted. And at the end of the interview with Lily Bissell, she said, now I understand your case. I presume what she had in mind, that she thought I had a analyzable neurosis. So I started my training at the New York Psychoanalytic. I graduated after 4 years of courses. It was a very, it was obvious. I mean, this was the instructors, Hartman, Chris, Lowenstein, Nick Young, Margaret Mahler, Edith Jacobson, Ruth Eisler. The faculty, of course, was superb. I referred to the New York Psychoanalytic as the Church of Rome of psychoanalysis. It was, of course, the place is, oligarchical and hierarchical and authoritarian, but I would refer to it as the authoritarianism of excellence. The teachers were certainly as good as it gets in American psychoanalysis. The Institute really had 2 factions. The Austro-Marxist Europeans mostly, and their American acolytes was one group, and they were in charge. The other group was the Arlo and Brenner and Jacobi faculty. And they, as I've written in a paper, psychoanalysts of the left and the far left were leftists, and as I point out in my paper, the 4 most important American psychoanalysts in the late 30s and early 40s, Arlo, Brenner, Rangel, and Greenson, all belonged to the Communist Party. And but and the one that left the latest was Jack Arlo. My analyst was an Austro-Marxist, part of the Freudian left, include Reich and Fenikel and Simo and Edith Jacobson, who actually did belong to the Communist Party. And as I've been thinking about it, of course, my analyst didn't tell me very much. He didn't tell me anything about his background, because in those days, analysts, were not supposed to, be self-disclosing. But I somehow regret that he didn't tell me more about himself, because I think had he done that, I may have made more effort to learn more from my father about his background and his life. So, how much time do I have? What time? Which time? What time is it?
It's 1:34. You've been speaking for 29 minutes.
29 minutes. Okay, 29 minutes. So I have 10 more minutes. All right. So let me summarize. I mean, there's a lot more I can say about my professional development and how I got to be where I am in terms. And I owe a lot, believe it or not, to Shelley Orgel. And we are, we became enemies about certification and the training analysis, because it was Shelley Orgel who told Homer Curtis that I might become editor of TAP, which was at that time the bulletin of the American Psychoanalytic Association that was edited by Estelle Shane. So I became the editor, and Helen Fisher, and mostly Helen, gave it the name, the American Psychoanalyst. And I edited that for 3 years, and it became a very successful publication. The first issue, it began with an issue marking the 50th anniversary of the death of Freud. And I published accounts of the various institutes. I had interviews, myself and Irene Cairo and other people interviewed people, and it became a very nice publication. So then Ted Shapiro finished as editor of JAPA, and so I decided to apply to become editor of JAPA. I think there were 5. I was applying: Bennett Simon, Warren Poland, Ethel Person, and Tony Christ. And at the beginning, they were offering a stipend of $25,000, or to continue Ted Shapiro's stipend. Then what's the name? Firestein decided they couldn't afford it, so the stipend was removed, which left only, I think, me and Bennett and Ethel Person to apply. So we did. We were actually, I was interviewed and Ethel was interviewed. Ethel's champion was Otto Kernberg, but he didn't come. He didn't show up at the meeting. And the committee was Herb Schlesinger, Harry Trostman, Otto Kernberg, who else? Otto Kernberg, and Jack Arlo, and Arnie Goldberg. And Jack Arlo was the chair. Of course, by then I had written several papers opposing, critical of self-psychology and self-psychology and Arnie Goldberg. And so that made me a little anxious about how I would be received. So, but my presentation, I was told, was wonderful. I told them things about JAPA they didn't know, and Arnie said that the vote for me to become editor was unanimous. And that was a very, very important milestone in my professional and organizational life. Because once I was editor, I felt that I didn't need anything from anyone. and I could be as outspoken, I could be as critical, I could say whatever I want to say. And so I took over JAP, and I think I did a great job. As soon as I became editor, the number of papers from institutes outside of the American, like IPTAR, increased enormously. And I published some papers that had been rejected, including, I guess, the paper by Wolf about the irrelevance of infant observation for psychoanalysis. And so that worked out well. But I decided, to take the job without money because they paid for a secretary. And the secretary, of course, was Tamar, and so she and I, ran the journal, and for those 10 years, and I proposed self-publishing rather than publishing by a publisher. And Judy Schachter supported me in that, even though their consultant Gladys Tapp said it was not a good idea. But the outcome was that during those 9 years, we increased the revenues to the American from the journal by $900,000 a year, for 9 years. So that was very important. And the other, fallout of that experience was, after I finished editing JAPA, I said, well, if we can publish a journal, we can publish books. And that's how IP Books got started. It was begun to publish a book by Sylvia Brody when RUP went belly up, and I guess the rest is history. In terms of 250 books, and then starting the International Journal of Controversial Discussions. Actually, we sold, a fair number of books at the meeting, including the issue 2, volume 2, Jew Hatred, the Black Milk of Civilization. Now, I think what I haven't spoken about is my, organizational life in psychoanalysis, of the New York Psychoanalytic, the dark side, of hierarchy and oligarchy, and a lot of stuff that I have been, involved in, the training analyst systems and so forth. I haven't told the story of how I got involved in arguing against certification after my wife was turned down, and in fact, Sandy Aben said to me that he would never forgive me for what I did. What did I do? I provided a platform for members to talk about education who had no business talking about it. And that was people who were not training analysts. And I am very proud of how I have impacted on the American Psychoanalytic Association and the changes that have occurred. But of course, we aren't where we might be, and that's a whole other story. And you can read about it in the memoir. I think I've talked enough.
Thank you, Arnie. I just want to say that you only scratched the surface of what's in the memoir.
Correct.
And that it can be pre-ordered there's a link on the email that gave us the link to get into this event. And you also have only 5 volumes of selected papers published so far?
Yeah, 5 selected papers, yes.
Yeah, and those are available also on the same website. So thank you, Arnie.
I always appreciate plugs.
So the next phase we're going to go through is the 7 presenters who Arnie has asked to talk will talk, and I arranged them in alphabetical order. So each gets to speak for 10 minutes. And the first is Jim Anderson, who's a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern University. He's the former president of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Society. He's edited the Annual of Psychoanalysis, and his book, Psychobiography in Search of the Inner Life, will be published by Oxford, and we will have a virtual event on that book when that happens. So, Jim, your turn.
Thank you. Well, the final thing that Arnie has just said to us, first he spoke about the hierarchy and oligarchy in American psychoanalysis. And his concluding statement was, "I'm proud of how I impacted on the American Psychoanalytic Association." Arnold Richards' excellent and informative memoir does what a memoir should do. It tells the story of his life in largely chronological order and reports in accurate detail about his experiences at the middle of the New York psychoanalytic world. But lurking under the surface of the memoir is a highly dramatic and important story about psychoanalysis over the past half century plus. When Arnie began his psychoanalytic training in 1964, psychoanalysis was seemingly at its zenith. Young psychiatrists clamored to get into the leading psychoanalytic institutes. I remember Arnie's contemporary in Chicago, John Ghetto, telling me that his supervisors had urged him to hurry and finish his psychoanalytic training because they had a list of patients wanting to get into psychoanalysis. They told Ghetto that as soon as he graduated, they could give him a full schedule of patients, a far cry from what things are like today. But to put it bluntly, psychoanalysis had gone haywire, especially in the country's first institute, the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, where Arnie trained. The psychoanalytic movement had painted itself into a corner and developed wrong-headed policies that were certain to bring about its rapid decline and threaten to kill the whole environment. Maybe not everybody will agree with me, but you'll hear what I have to say. Arnie was one of the chosen few who was invited into the inner circle of the New York Institute, and he could easily have enjoyed all the rewards going to the favored sons. But instead, he became a leading opponent of just about all the key policies that were so destructive to psychoanalysis. Here are some of those policies and approaches. The New York Institute was run by a small coterie who, power-hungry and arrogant, ruthlessly excluded all others from the running of the Institute. Arnie could have joined them, but instead sided with the outsiders. Similarly, at the American Psychoanalytic Association, the old-fashioned orthodox insiders wielded power and used the so-called certification process to keep those they saw as their inferiors from becoming full members of the association and having voting rights. It was bad enough that they kept out most fully trained psychoanalysts from becoming full members of the American Psychoanalytic Association. But what was really devastating for the future of the field is that they barred all non-MDs from becoming psychoanalysts and members of the association. Even though Freud himself had been a fierce defender of the non-MDs, and even though many of the greatest psychoanalysts ever were non-MDs, such as Erik Erikson, Otto Rank, Melanie Klein, Erich Fromm, and Freud's own daughter, Anna Freud. We know some of the reasons for Arnie's opposition. He wanted his highly qualified and incredibly competent wife, Arlene, to become certified and to become a full member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. But as a holder of a PhD and not an MD, she was barred from advancing. She applied.
Hello? Hello?
We lost your sound, Jim.
He's muted.
Thank you. Excuse me for that mistake. I'll go back just a little bit.
Arlene.
Arlene.
Yeah, so Arlene, a big reason, Arlene was incredibly competent and wanted to become certified and applied for certification and was turned down, not because she lacked skill, but because the powers that be wanted to exclude her because they wanted to exclude, as almost all of the non-MDs, from certification. Seeing the injustice, Arnie became a force in the anti-certification fight. Arlene boldly applied again the following year, and this time they passed her. Here is possibly my favorite line in the whole memoir. The committee chair said to her after she passed, "I hope now you will call off your husband." The appearance is that the conservatives passed her because they thought that that would get Arnie to stop his bulldog-like opposition to certification. But of course, that didn't stop Arnie. Apart from these matters that have to do with power, there was something else even more important. The old guard had developed a nonsensically narrow form of psychoanalysis. There were strict rules on so-called neutrality, for example. Arnie referenced his analyst never talking about himself. An example of these was that an analyst would not accept a gift from a patient. I remember one story of a patient giving an analyst a plate of cookies. She tried to hand the plate to him, and he refused to accept it. She then put it on the desk. It lay there for days, seemingly untouched. Another practice was that an analyst would judge analyzability, and only a tiny portion of people who needed help were deemed to be analyzable. In Chicago, the Psychoanalytic Institute made many lifelong enemies by telling aspiring patients that they were unanalyzable. The old guard had developed a caricature of psychoanalysis that was exposed in Janet Malcolm's famous book, Psychoanalysis, the Impossible Profession. Arnie, again, could have gone on as an insider, but he supported many of the reforms that enabled psychoanalysis to progress, such as dropping those strict rules of analyzability and allowing for newer approaches to psychoanalysis that enabled a greater number of people to get the treatment they needed. In other words, the wider scope of psychoanalysis, instead of getting more and narrower, developing ways to treat a wider range of patients. Now, there is a paradox here that I'd like to hear more about. So this is directed to you, Arnie. On the one hand, Arnie became an attack dog against two of the major new movements, the self-psychology of Heinz Kohut and the relational psychoanalysis, of which Stephen Mitchell was a leading proponent. And yet, he believed that psychoanalysis needed new approaches in order to grow, and in many ways, he supported the development of new approaches. Now, the gist of it is that psychoanalysis would have just about died if not for two developments that the old guard bitterly fought against and that Arnie supported. First, non-MDs were allowed to become psychoanalysts. Of course, there's a whole long story of this having to do with the lawsuit, but if not for this change, there would have been just about no one to undertake psychoanalytic training now, if not for this change. Psychiatry has turned away from psychoanalysis, and as Arnie points out in his memoir, a tiny number of young psychiatrists want to become psychoanalysts today. Second, psychoanalysis has expanded despite the rigid intransigence of the old guard, so that a far wider range of patients can be treated. In conclusion, Arnie has been a major player in the progress that psychoanalysis has undergone since he began his training 59 years ago. My major question for Arnie, and hear this please, Arnie, is what motivations led you to put aside your apparent self-interest and take these progressive positions? Part of the reason is that Arnie saw how his wife was being excluded because of being a non-MD, but I realized that isn't the whole story, and I'd like to hear more from him about why he was able to promote the advancement of psychoanalysis. His memoir describes the specific of many of the battles over change, but what is it about Arnie's personality that enabled him not to become a dyed-in-the-wool conservative who opposed innovations, but instead to become a key player in the forward movement that has saved psychoanalysis?
Excellent question, Jim.
Okay, so we can do that question during the back and forth between the presenters.
Yes.
You want.
Excellent.
So our next speaker is Daniel Benveniste, who, I hope I said that right, Daniel. He's a clinical psychologist practicing in Sammamish, Washington. He has written this mammoth book called The Interwoven Lives of Sigmund, Anna, and W. Ernest Freud, Three Generations of Psychoanalysis. He's edited Anna Freud in the Hampstead Clinic, Letters to Humberto Najera, and he is the author of Libido, Culture and Consciousness, Revisiting Freud's Totem and Taboo. Take it away. Got 10 minutes.
All right, thanks again. I want to begin by saying thank you, Arnie. Your memoir is a gift to our thought collective. With his forthcoming memoir, Arnie has situated himself both in history and in the context of his thought collective. It is the thought collective in which he was educated, in which he matured, and to which he later contributed. In the 1960s, if we were puzzled by someone's behavior, we would ask, "Where are you coming from?" Arnie asks this of everybody he meets. He wants to know their last name, where their grandparents came from. He wants to know their context. He wants to know where they're coming from. In his memoirs, he takes us back to where he's coming from, back to his family's roots in Russia, Ukraine, Galicia, the revolution, the wars, the emigrations, and Brooklyn. Knowing him as we do today, we're not surprised to learn of his stellar academic performance or his march through med school, psychiatric training, psychoanalytic training, and the heart of organizational psychoanalysis. But what surprises us is the fact that after being a dutiful participant in American psychoanalytic organizational life, he suddenly became an observer, a participant observer, a critical thinker, theories and people. Now, I've long been fascinated by the Oedipus complex. My only critique is that it is often regarded too literally and not metaphorically enough. Aside from that, I have an observation of the relationship between the Oedipus complex and the American psychoanalytic organizations in the 20th century. And my observation is that American psychoanalysis was significantly influenced by the same cultural trends that gave rise to the generation gap observed in the second half of the 20th century. It was the generation gap between the fathers, or the establishment, and their sons, that is, the next generation, in American psychoanalytic organizations. Now, I'm an outsider to American psychoanalytic organizational life, but as a psychoanalytically oriented clinical psychologist, colleague of many analysts, and as a psychoanalytic historian, I've observed the tendency of the fathers, or the leaders, of the American psychoanalytic institutes to raise standards, which in turn raised the age of admissions to institutes. They found more and more reasons to exclude candidates, reasons to keep them in training for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and to demand that candidates conform to the theoretical and technical demands of the fathers. The desires, ambitions, and creativity of the candidates were often seen as manifestations of the Oedipus complex, efforts to kill the father without recognizing that the only way for psychoanalysis to continue would be for the fathers to teach them well and pass the torch of psychoanalysis to the next generation. This tendency of the fathers, the organization, to stifle creativity, snuff out ambition, exclude candidates, hold back advancement, and in other ways limit the next generation of psychoanalysis is what I call a manifestation of the Laius complex in American psychoanalysis. You'll recall that Laius was Oedipus's father, but Laius had a history before Oedipus was even born. Laius was entrusted to train a young boy, Chrysippus, in how to drive a chariot, and instead of doing so, he raped the young boy. His punishment for this, as told to him by the oracle, was that his firstborn son would kill him and marry his wife. So when the time came, Laius decided to kill his own son. Now get this picture. Laius molested a young boy, tried and failed to have his infant son Oedipus killed on a mountainside, and years later, when he met Oedipus on the road, he tried to kill him again. This, from my perspective, is what organized American psychoanalysis did in the second half of the 20th century. It did its very best to hold down, exclude, and limit the creativity of the next generation. And by the 1980s, they almost drove psychoanalysis into extinction. And you know something interesting? They don't seem to do that in Latin America. And they also didn't have a generation gap there. And I don't think they do that so much anymore in the United States either. But I think in the second half of the 20th century, that was pretty common, and it stunted psychoanalysis. Some people, I have heard, think Arnie Richards has been trying to destroy psychoanalysis. I'd say he has a Polybus complex. Polybus and Merope were the ones who adopted the infant Oedipus and raised him to adulthood. Arnie Richards, with his Polybus complex, has been running interference between Laius and Oedipus for decades in an effort to give psychoanalysis a future. And I think he's been incredibly successful in his efforts, along with others, to open the doors to lay analysis, women, to lay analysts, women, people of color, and to the Chinese in China. He's also published over 250 authors through IP Books, and he's engaged different theorists and invited them into the psychoanalytic village square to discuss the limits and benefits of alternative theories in relation to modern conflict theory. Arnie spoke earlier about the turning points in his life when his fate could have gone in one direction or another. The what-if questions are of great interest to historians everywhere, as they can see better than others that the outcomes of history are not inevitable, and that sometimes small accidents or random events ended up having huge consequences. Arnie has presented these turning points in his life, which ended up making him into who he is today. And now, at the risk of making him uncomfortable in this, his memoir conference, I ask in front of you all, who would I be without Arnie Richards? He only published 3 of my books, put a bunch of my articles on his website, proposed my honorary membership in the American Psychoanalytic Association, brought me into the International Journal of Controversial Discussions, and then shipped me off to China to teach in Wuhan. You know what? I don't think I'm particularly unusual. Arnie Richards has been there for countless people, opening doors for them, promoting them, encouraging them, and providing opportunities. Arnie Richards has been making good trouble for psychoanalysis for decades, and in doing so, has created its chances for survival. In closing, I'd like to paraphrase what was once said about the Grateful Dead. Arnie Richards isn't the best at what he does. He's the only one that does what he does. Here's to you, Arnie. L'chaim, and muchas gracias.
I blush.
All right. So we have a blushing Dr. Richards and a wine-drinking Daniel Benveniste. And we are now going to take a 10-minute break. So we're back. A few things. Again, we will have 5 more presenters, then take a 5-minute break. Then there'll be a 20-minute discussion between Arnie and the presenters, and then we will be taking questions from the attendees. And I'm also going to mention that Arnie is planning a book tour. And so once that is set, we will email everybody who has signed up for this to let them know if he's going to be anywhere near where you are. So, all right. Next speaker is David James Fisher, also known as Jimmy. He's got a doctorate in history and practices psychoanalysis in Los Angeles. He has authored important works on Bruno Bettelheim, Romain Rolland. He's written The Cultural Theory and Psychoanalytic Tradition and put together a memoir that his late wife wrote called Surrogate, which he wrote comments on, How a Woman Named Sandra Made Me a Mother. It's my pleasure to recognize you for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Ken and Arnie for inviting me to participate in this celebration. I am a recent member of Arnie Richards' Thought Collective. I have published over 10 articles on his psychoanalytic blog, ip.net. Josh Hoffs has called this blog the, quote, most interesting psychoanalytic publication in the world today, end of quote. Arnie published a book by my late wife, Karen Fund, which Ken just mentioned, called Surrogate, How a Woman Named Sandra Made Me a Mother, in his publishing house, International Psychoanalytic Books. Incidentally, Ken wrote a beautiful review of that book, which I very much appreciated. Arnie has also published a novel by my brother, Andrew Fisher, called Smoke Ring Day, published in 2019, which is a page turner and which I enthusiastically endorse. 2 more volumes of Andy's novel will be forthcoming. Arnie and I were both born in Brooklyn. He attended the same high school, Erasmus Hall, that my mother, Bess Kaufman Fisher, graduated from. His immersion and fluency in Yiddish vastly exceed my meager understanding of that lost language, although I share his grief in mourning the death of this rich and expressive language. Both of us are non-Jewish Jews, to borrow the title of Isaac Deutscher's evocative essay, although we may be too Jewish to be entirely non-Jewish Jews, if you get my drift. Arnie clearly retains a sense of justice and righteousness that is intrinsically Jewish, though we Jews hardly have a monopoly on it. I share some of his controversial positions on Israel, where he always defends Israel's historic right to exist, while being critical of Netanyahu and the extreme right in Israel. On the occasions of our meetings in person or by phone, I have consistently experienced his vitality, his intellectual curiosity, his openness to a variety of perspectives, not least his commitment to democracy and inclusion, particularly his stances on contemporary psychoanalysis. When I am with him, I re-experience the stimulation of Madison, Wisconsin in the middle and late 60s, Paris in the 1970s, and the best moments of high-level exchanges with friends and colleagues over the years. He has tons of stories. It appears that he knows or knows of everyone in the field and adjacent fields. His discourse blends a distinct form of insight, the capacity to make surprising and illuminating linkages, spiced with gossip and entertainment. He is an unabashed and enthusiastic entrepreneur. I leave my encounters with Arnie intellectually and clinically excited, wanting more. He is fun and fun-loving. I think of him as a force of nature. Because he lives 2 miles from Trump's club in Mar-a-Lago, I kid him about being part of the left opposition of Palm Beach, Florida, a strange place to settle for the son of a Bolshevik father. Andre Malraux wrote in his autobiography, Memoirs, that man is what he does and what he hides. Arnie's memoir, Unorthodox, reveals how much he has done and continues to do. He speaks of his specialness in the Richards family, a specialness marked by an initial survival because he was supposed to be aborted, having been conceived in the horrendous early years of the Depression. He clearly was his family's favorite, his home surrounded by visible signs of his awards, achievements, and accomplishments. One can only imagine the resentments and envy as well as love and idealization that this generated by his siblings. He was a brilliant student and a facile learner. Arnie was esteemed as someone who would achieve great things in his life. His confidence and self-regard were apparent to all. I wondered about the meaning and various causation of his writing blockage, which was not elaborated in the memoir. Perhaps he can say something about that later. I wish he could provide the readers with a deeper understanding of his vulnerabilities and anxieties. He certainly has compensated for his early writer's blockage, having produced 5 volumes of articles, essays, and diverse publications. There is a dialectic, I believe, in Arnie's inner world, perhaps deriving from a tension between being extraordinary and a fear of being ordinary, a fragility that may have engendered a need for perfection or for grounding his practice of psychoanalysis in a secure scientific knowledge. Along with this search for certainty, there may be difficulty tolerating uncertainty, not knowing, and the messiness which all psychoanalysts are very familiar with. Arnie has titled his memoir Unorthodox, but of course he was orthodox before he was unorthodox as a Jew and a psychoanalyst. If I were to critique him, I still find him too orthodox and not unorthodox enough. But perhaps all of us blend a form of ritual and spontaneity, tradition and subversiveness, adherence to the past, and desire to innovate and improvise in the present. We could hold a profitable second conference examining Arnie's critique of self-psychology in the contemporary relational school. It might make for a stimulating forum to hear their rejoinders and rebuttals of his positions, and Arnie would not be a wallflower in his rebuttals to their rebuttals. Arnie himself in his early professional years was valued by the older generation of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and the American. They promoted him and advanced him, making him feel like their darling, another example of feeling special. Only later would he understand that their inclusion required conformism, compliance, and accommodation on his part. I have been told by other insiders who were later banished or excluded from the analytic establishment that the fall from power is very distressing, very difficult to process, even if it generates new experiences, creative and constructive thinking. When Arnie began to function as unorthodox, he ultimately lost his standing at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, most poignantly losing good friends, even best friends. His reputation was toppled, suddenly becoming a pariah, someone who was debunked, dismissed, and considered a destroyer of psychoanalytic education, hierarchies, and power structures. He realized from the inside that institutional American psychoanalysis was a, quote, unfree association, end of quote, that becoming a training analyst was more based on anointment than merit, more grounded in pleasing or mirroring and not challenging the power structure than based on proficiency in psychoanalytic practice and theory. Although he is somewhat unclear about this in his memoir, I sense that his wife Arlene's role was decisive in its impact on Arnie's turn from orthodox to unorthodox. That is, by Arlene's feminist psychoanalytic orientation and her politics of dissent radicalized and politicized Arnie. He was also deeply troubled and hurt by the ways the analytic psychiatrists of his institute and the American mistreated and misrecognized her. Orthodoxy, of course, speaks to forms of accommodation and unquestioning acceptance of the law as if it were handed down from above. In psychoanalysts for individuals of Arnie's generation, it was the classics of Freud and of ego psychology that were revered and idealized, not read in the spirit of skepticism or placed into a historical framework. As he became more engaged with the subversiveness of psychoanalytic method and to the necessity of challenging dogma, Arnie reversed course, trying to create space so that analytic practice could be restored to its origins, namely adherence to experimentation, innovation, audacious thinking, rethinking of shibboleths, and above all, advocating for an inclusive large tent democratic organization that would open psychoanalysis to all serious candidates. More and more, he emphasized the importance of being present and active clinically, of learning from his patients. He would probably agree with Einstein that imagination was more important than knowledge, without minimizing the importance of reflected upon knowledge and never being anti-intellectual. We all know that orthodoxy is mostly connected to conservative attitudes in either religious or political institutions. Psychoanalysis is no different. Arnie became marginalized. His view of a basic authoritarian orientation of mainstream psychoanalysis engendered a backlash against him, one that often descended into ad hominem attacks and absurd misrepresentation of his ideas, not genuine exchange or serious debate of the issues he raised. For those of us who have studied the history of psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic politics can be highly nasty and aggressive, sometimes outright vicious. We have the gift to hurt and injure our so-called opponents, especially apostates. Our history has been too much dominated by the expulsion of dissidents, by those in power ruling with a fierce, unapologetic form of arrogance, omniscience, of knowing too much, often leading to splits and bitterness among our members and former members. Arnie, of course, always felt special. It can also be special to be seen as the Mac the Knife of American psychoanalysis. I'm sorry Arnie didn't read the passages about him being Mac the Knife. This is a reference he borrowed from Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht's The Threepenny Opera, most memorably sung, in my opinion, in Bobby Darin's version. Arnie seems almost gleeful about being Mac the Knife. He can be cutting, polemical, corrosive in his deconstruction of the culture of American psychoanalysis. Yet there may be some gains in this stance for him. Instead of feeling rejected and cast aside by his old comrades and his students, the Mac the Knife Arnie may be working through and mastering the trauma of being abandoned and maybe doing something reparative. In this sense, the will to cut may be a creative will, restoring and repairing the self, providing restitution and personal transformation. The polemicist may also have a secret wish or fantasy to be understood and is somewhat mystified by why he is not liked. Let me conclude by saying that every memoir may become the basis for a biography. My fantasy about a biography of Arnie Richards is that it would require a contemporary Dostoevsky, one who can combine novelistic techniques with storytelling and a rich imagination to capture the leading character's paradoxes and unknowability. This 21st century Dostoevsky would have to be versed in cultural Jewishness and Jewish history, be fluent in Yiddish, accept Arnie's entrepreneurial activities and his multiple passions and preoccupations, including his current stance as an analytic subversive, and his obsession with tracking down which psychoanalysts were members of the Communist Party. The novelist, historian, expert in personality dynamics would also have to be able to capture Arnie's unlimited energy, aliveness, complexity, and yes, specialness. Perhaps there is someone in today's audience who might step up to the task. It will take a very special biographer to write a biography of this special individual. Any Dostoevskys out there on Zoom? Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Henry Friedman is our next speaker. Dr. Friedman is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's on the editorial boards of Psychoanalytic Quarterly, American Journal of Psychoanalysis, and the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He has written, among other things, The Need for and Resistance to Realness in the Analyst, Making Psychoanalysis a Truly Two-Person Experience, and he has written an interesting paper called Carol Gilligan, An Introduction. I'm not sure who's that about. Now, take it away, Dr. Friedman.
Well, I have just spent the last week at the American Psychoanalytic Association meetings. And during that period, while I was attending the meetings and experiencing some of the change and some of the rigidity that still remains, and enjoying some of the aspects of being an ambivalently held member of the American, I was reading the memoir at night, and I also started to write about it. So it turned out in the end, I wrote something so long that it obviously is not really appropriate. So I'm going to have to speak pretty spontaneously about the fact that when I read the memoir of First Place, it came to mind how different our life experiences have been, how far from what Arnie's childhood was like. My father was a baseball player. He went up to the minor leagues. He wanted to distance himself from anything other than being an American. We knew nothing about synagogues or practices. And at one point when I'm reading Arnie's memoir and he's talking about anti-Zionist, non-religious Jews, I felt like he was accusing me of being myself, my assimilated self. But then I felt, no, he was telling me about a difference in background that I found quite remarkable, and how far he had traveled in the ways that he had. I went to Hopkins for medical school after going to the University of Wisconsin on a Ford Foundation scholarship, which I chose to go there rather than Columbia because my parents wanted me to get away from New York and not just be aware of New York. Then I must share something with Arnie, which is when I applied to Columbia Medical School and was interviewed, I was told, "Oh, you really have a great record, but we're really sorry that we can't take you," because I said, "Why?" I said, "You're the wrong kind of Jew. We like to take banking and mercantile Jews, and we have only a few places, and we only take people from those kinds of backgrounds, and that's not yours." Fortunately, Hopkins, which was enormously anti-Semitic, did take me and did treat me as an outsider, but it was a great education. So after that, I went to Mass Mental Health Center, where Arnie was turned down and had an excellent psychiatry education. And then I started training at the Boston Psychoanalytic. And it's around there that Arnie crosses my life, but not in a very positive way. I had begun to go to the meetings, and Arnie had emerged as an enemy of self-psychology, of relational, of Mitchell and Greenberg. And I simply encountered him as a kind of lieutenant of Charles Brenner's and the New York psychoanalytic power structure. And it was very clear that if you weren't part of that, they didn't want to have very much to do with you. And somehow, I don't know why it was, but although Arnie was so clearly connected, he was actually friendly, which was important. And a link that I had to Arnie was through Judy Schechter, who Sandy Abben for the presidency, surprising everyone, and produced an administration that changed things in an enormous way. And the big change was that Judy got Paul Mosier to set up something called the Open Line, which became the members list. And suddenly I found myself being able to post about various things that I found important in psychoanalysis. And Arnie may have come to oppose certification because of what the committee did to Arlene. I opposed it because I thought, number one, I'll never pass that. I know what I did with my patients. I know that I helped them. But if I ever submitted what I actually did, I'd be dead in the water. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. You know what? I may be masochistic, but not that masochistic that I'm going to let these guys get their hands on me and tell me to rewrite and rewrite. I also began to discover from colleagues who had been turned down how they had been told they had to rewrite it. And I somehow became enraged at the idea that this is how people were being forced to conform to a narrow version of psychoanalysis, a version so totally devoid of human contact and interaction. A kind of non-person. There's a one person where the analyst is the interpreter. There's a two person where both people interact, but there's a no person where the analyst is very silent, judgmental, and doesn't do much. At any rate, Arnie and I and a few other people started to bombard the members list with protests about certification and an understanding that it was neither reliable nor valid. And somehow we were able to actually begin to mobilize what I would guess was a majority of people who had never seen the possibility of protesting, that an organization that had been ruled from above and where most of the members were passive suddenly got mobilized. Now, some were mobilized on the side of authority and very opposed to any questioning. But Arnie and I persisted, and we did amazingly achieve not only changes, but eventually got a movement to say that BOPs couldn't control all the education and couldn't control the organization. And at that point, 7 BOPs members sued the organization. There was a lawsuit, and we lost. And we were told that the only way by the judge, that the only way that we could salvage it was if we passed a bylaw amendment taking BOPs' power out. And to my surprise, a continued campaign and a wonderful letter by Luba Kessler led to a vote to adopt that bylaw amendment and take BOPs' power out of the organization. The rest has been changes in how the American is run. Although I do think still that analysis is being taught in a way that dehumanizes the participants. And I spent a great deal of time trying to increase the amount, the degree to which we challenge technical rules that it seems to me separate the analyst from the patient and mystify the analyst as a person who never answers questions, deflects, and still thinks that that's a relationship. Arnie and I have become closer. He's published some things that I've written. I'm particularly proud and pleased with the piece that I wrote in response to his article on Freud's godlessness, in which Arnie, traces amazing data about Freud's background and how, in Arnie's eyes, Freud is trying to disguise and move away from his deep Jewish roots. And Freud, he gives me data I didn't have. Freud didn't want to get married under a chuppah. He only did so when he was told that if he didn't have a Jewish service, he couldn't be legally married in Austria. He didn't circumcise his children. And Arnie is using all of this material to say that Freud was defensive and was trying to distance himself for a variety of reasons. And I wrote a response that said, no, I think Arnie, he's talking about things that someone like myself has done, not because we were trying to disguise anything, but because we didn't like those rituals and we didn't think they were a necessary part of life. I don't know whether Arnie actually read my response to his paper, which was excellent in terms of its details.
You've spoken for about 12 minutes. If you can finish soon, that would be fine.
I can finish right away.
Okay.
Let's say that I continue to experience Arnie as a great ally in the fight to change the American Psychoanalytic Association, but also to change how analysts work with patients in the present setting. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jane Hall is our next speaker. Jane has been past president of the Contemporary Freudian Society, was a North American representative to the IPA board from 2017 to 2019. She served on the board of directors of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's the author of Roadblocks on the Journey of Psychotherapy and Deepening the Treatment. And she was a founder of the New York School for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy. Jane.
Thank you. I must begin by thanking Uncle Joe and the Spinster sisters in chapter 1 for seeing to it that Arnie was indeed born, because being born means being included. And Arnie has certainly paid that inclusive attitude forward big time. And it's one of the reasons that I love him. The ability to include is very special, and it indicates an open heart and an open mind. As Martin Luther King said, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. What began as a professional acquaintance with Arnie and Arlene changed dramatically about 30 years ago into a supportive and loving friendship that Jim, my past husband, and I cherished. And now that Jim is gone, I cherish it even more. So it is an honor to be on this panel. About 30 years ago, a crisis brought the four of us together. Both our children were fighting cancer. I remember having dinner together almost every week and holding hands in a short, silent prayer for our children who were both waging war against the disease. Happily, they are both busy and well. I soon felt like part of the family, included in the celebration of weddings, birthdays, Thanksgiving, and getting to know Rebecca, Tamar, and Larry, Stephen, Justin, and Larry's parents. And I must mention Winnie, their poodle, who sadly left us not long ago after living a long and spectacular life, having been included wherever Arnie and Arlene went. Parties, conferences, sessions, sometimes incognito and safely hidden in Arlene's bag, but usually free to meet and greet. So I speak here today as part of the family. Our childhoods were very different. I grew up in a small town, no sidewalks, lots of woods and fields, with only 4 Jewish kids in my class of about 22 from kindergarten to 12th grade. No temple in my small town, and I quit Sunday school in 2nd grade. So my Jewish roots consisted of going to temple in another town on the high holy days and a Seder each year. But although we never connected on religion, I do identify with Arnie's worldview and his exploration of ideas and his comfort with all kinds of people. Actually, Arnie knows everyone, and everyone seems to know Arnie. I applaud his decision to choose Menninger, which I believe provided him with much more than the average New York analyst trained at Einstein. His views are worldly versus the more insular, provincial, and often conservative mindsets of his early colleagues. Arnie refused to be intimidated by conservatism. Actually, his mind is an open one, ready to explore all points of view with benevolent curiosity. I will never forget attending his Brill lecture so many years ago with Jim, and now we were how we were absolutely blown away. We realized then that he was a pioneer, not content with the status quo. And since Jim, a jazz musician, was a pioneer too, he was thrilled. Sitting in the New York Psychoanalytic Auditorium, surrounded by conservative analysts, we felt the shock and the electricity, and it was definitely a high point. Here was Arnie at his best, speaking the truth about a man he was chosen to honor. That inspiring evening gave me courage to find my own voice. Being honest and unafraid to speak out about injustice often gains one enemies, but sitting by quietly seems harmful in my opinion. Without his encouragement, I would have not published my new book, which challenges many ideas that I learned at the Institute and offering a new way to think about clinical work. Arnie and, by the way, the name of it is The Power of Connection. Arnie and Arlene eventually bought a house near us in the country in Garrison, New York. They had let it be known that they were looking for a place, and we invited them to lunch at our house in the woods. There was one house for sale nearby, and they bought it the very next day. They loved it, and of course, we were so happy. I have never met a couple as active and on the go as A&A. As everyone knows, Arnie is a powerhouse. His energy sometimes tires me out, but without it, I think we would all be at a loss. One day we were hanging out on our porch, and I mentioned my idea of a conference that would include all schools of analysis. And before I knew it, Arnie was on board. We formed a committee, and within a few months, we moved on our plan. So we produced a terrific conference called The Future of Psychoanalysis with Jürgen Rieder from Sweden as a keynote speaker. We invited all the analytic programs, theorists, societies, including Jungians, Adlerians, Spotnitzians, Lacanians, Freudians, you name it. Representatives from each group, society, or institute spoke on different panels. The guests representing APSA seemed stunned to be surrounded by the others. It seemed like a rude awakening to them that there were, in fact, others in the field. But everyone else was really thrilled. I remember asking the attendees to sit with people they never had met at lunch in the cafeteria of L'École Française in New York. I wish we could have bottled that atmosphere of inclusiveness. We all have so much to learn from each other, and for one glorious weekend, the walls came down. What a high. There is so much to be gained from inclusiveness. Now, I don't have to tell you that Arnie is unstoppable. His enthusiasm for this field knows no bounds. As editor of JAPA and before that, the TAP, he began a trend of open-mindedness. The journal made more money than it had before and after his stewardship. The open mind is rare, and I have found very few in our field who are able to greet different ideas with curiosity instead of derision. Analysts have a tendency to revere the past, which is ironic because we work with our patients to grow beyond. So with Arnie's memoir, we see the theme of inclusiveness in everything that he has done. The history of American psychoanalysis is captured in the later chapters of this engrossing memoir and serve to remind us of APSA's history of exclusionary practices. It is clear to me that only those who are frightened believe in authoritarianism leading to oligarchy. Arnie's attitude proves to me that he has gone beyond most of his cohorts, some of whom actually stopped speaking to him. Instead of embracing or at least appreciating his attitude, his own society rejected him on a technicality not too long ago. Excluding him was a small-minded act by small-minded people who undoubtedly felt threatened. I think his open-mindedness was a thorn in their side, a thorn that might have punctured the conversation, the conservative bubble, letting in some fresh air. American psychoanalysis had become a china shop. Not only that, but there were guards at the door. That is, until Arnie came on the scene. Thanks to him and his ecumenical spirit, his dedication to inclusiveness, and his courage, I believe he has contributed to whatever growth we can find in this exclusive club where a two-tier system still operates. I believe he deserves a medal, a plaque. How about a statue right in front of NYPI building on East 82nd Street? Arnie Richards is a force to be contended with, a force that has served psychoanalysis well. So Arnie, thank you with all my heart.
And thank you, Jane. Leon Hoffman is next. He is the co-director of the Pacella Research Center in a place called the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. He is chief psychiatrist and psychoanalyst at the West End Day School in New York City. He's a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association and co-author of Regulation-Focused Psychotherapy for Children, and he edited The Evaluation and Care of Severely Disturbed Children and Their Families. Dr. Hoffman. You're muted. Unmute yourself. Keep trying.
Sorry about that. I apologize. I really thank Arnie for inviting me to speak, and listening to the other speakers made me realize that my talk is going to be a little bit different. I titled my talk, The Power of Listening, a tribute to Arnold Richards. We're honoring Arnie today for his contribution to psychoanalytic scholarship, psychoanalytic theory and technique, and psychoanalytic politics. As I told Arnie, I will spend my few minutes addressing Arnie's discussion of the universality of authoritarian approaches to psychoanalytic theory by a variety of important contributors to the field. Here are three critiques that Arnie describes. Quote, Stephen Mitchell and Jay Greenberg might have been young rebels, but they were just as dogmatic and authoritarian as everyone else. We had some fights. I believe that unconscious drive-related conflict and developmental deficit, an arrest or a mental insufficiency requiring empathic and reparative techniques are interactive variables. Conflict leads to deficit, and deficit affects the way conflict is experienced. Again, to bring up my frequent bet nar, I'm against dichotomies, and that was my problem with Mitchell and Greenberg. I think the reason Freud has survived as well as he has is that he never came down on one side of the dichotomies. He was always for nature and for nurture and nature, conflict and deficit. He always embraced a complex, even dialectical view of human mental functioning, unquote. The second quote, if Reich and other non-physicians had found a welcome at NIPSI, they would have become part of APS's psychoanalytic establishment, but they had not, and they did not. Excluded from the Big Tent in 1948, they formed a tent of their own, the founding of the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis, NPAP. And this was the beginning of the balkanization of American psychoanalysis. And I stress the word balkanization because I believe that has been a huge problem in the field. Quote number 3. In such a divisive context, two groups naturally formed the ins and outs at NIPSI. The two groups were defined by personalities more than issues. Arnie discusses various actors at NIPSI, ending this section with the following comment, quote, all of which would feed into one of my most important papers, my 1999 Brill lecture titled A.A. Brill and the Politics of Exclusion. Arnie stresses that, quote, exclusion extended to theory as well as discipline. I think there was more openness to unorthodox Freudian views in the early 30s than there was after the Europeans came a few years later, unquote. Here's my question. Political conflict with organizations, including scientific ones, seems to be ubiquitous. Is it more prevalent in psychoanalytic organizations? I do not know. A group of sociologists say, quote, they argue that a covert conflict encompasses 4 interrelated elements: contestation of institutionalized power and authority, perceptions of collective injury, social occlusion, and officially forbidden forms of defense, unquote. They suggest that social network analysis could also illuminate the informal social structures that constrain, enable, or sustain covert conflict. Other approaches, such as event history analysis and diffusion studies, could help establish the central tendencies of covert conflict across diverse organizational and historical contexts, unquote. Such a sociological analysis might have an ameliorative effect on some of the political conflicts that occur within analytic organizations, as described by Arnie. It is quite possible that an independent sociological analysis may have more impact on the organization. Whether or not that would be of value, worth the time, effort, and money, obviously I don't have the expertise to opine on. But in my opinion, there are more important matters to focus on. And in this final quote, Arnie touches on what I think is the most important goal for the field of psychoanalysis: dissemination of psychoanalytic ideas among mainstream mental health professionals. Arnie says, if our goal is indeed to advance psychoanalysis as a science, and not simply to defend our hegemony, the effort to represent our interests to other psychoanalysts, including self-psychologists, relational psychologists, and interpersonalists, must engage these colleagues constructively. If we want them to listen to us, we must be prepared to listen to them. Thus, to appropriate the positive aspect of Brill's legacy, we must finally disavow its obverse, the politics of exclusion sustained by its enshrinement of dogma. We must acknowledge the inescapability of institutional pressures in the unfolding of any theory, unquote. With this statement, Arnie is correct. We need to advance the science of psychoanalysis. However, is the main audience of our work other psychoanalysts? Here, Arnie was addressing members of NIPSI. Arnie's idea about the hegemonic impulses among psychoanalysts was echoed by Arnold Cooper's 2008 assertion when he likened the pluralism in contemporary psychoanalysis to a multiplicity of authoritarian orthodoxies. Bernardi in 2005 noted that pluralism allows each analyst to recognize that there's no ideal model, not a true psychoanalysis, and to choose a way of working that will be most beneficial to each patient. But Bernardi also notes that, quote, there's a dark side of pluralism that appears when it is chosen without critical analysis of the advantages and disadvantages of its different theoretical and technical approaches. The benefit of pluralism is the freedom to connect with different ways of thinking and practicing psychoanalysis. An attitude of research, leaving theory standing by, is then necessary. Bernardi notes that when new currents in psychoanalysis appear, they occur without systematic comparisons with older currents. Bernardi stresses that controversies should not be stifled but alternate hypotheses should always be considered. But how are alternate hypotheses addressed by psychoanalysts? How are alternate hypotheses evaluated? In fact, the idea that both the Arnies, Cooper and Richards, hold of contemporary hegemonic theory construction, at least by so-called classical analysts, seems to be questioned by two pieces of data. One, in 2020, in the preparation for a paper, I polled the faculty of NIPSI, asking them the following question: can you share your preferred psychoanalytic perspective? And I listed a whole bunch of theories, relational, etc., self-psychology. There were 44 responses. 24 endorsed MC modern conflict theory, with 10 including a variety of other models, mainly eclectic. 9 simply included eclectic. 4 mentioned ego psychology, object relations, Kohlbergian theory. 2 endorsed interpersonal relation. 2 endorsed Kleinian, plus 1 from the modern conflict theory group. And 2 faculty members noted the importance of understanding the complex unconscious mechanisms that need to be considered. There were notations about the absence in my list of Laplanche, Bionian field theory, object relation theory, and Kohlbergian theory. It is important to stress that including those who endorsed another perspective while endorsing MCT, fully 2/3 of the faculty at NIPSI who responded to the questionnaire, supposedly the bastion of old-fashioned classic psychoanalysis, practice and utilize a variety of theories in addition to or other than modern conflict theory. 2, this finding is comparable to the quote by the authors, unexpected findings, this is by Mendelssohn and others, in 1992, quote, that the classicists, that is members of the Boston and New York Psychoanalytic Institutes, who were statistically similar to one another, were significantly more heterogeneous in their views than the interpersonal analysts, that is, members of the William Allison White Institute. That is, the classical analysts generally disagreed among themselves and showed a wide range of views. The interpersonalists tended to present greater agreement on the aspects of theory and technique covered by this questionnaire, unquote. So how can we study how analysts make their decisions, both theoretically and in practice? Obviously, that needs to be studied systematically. Unfortunately, the long-standing gap and tension between science and practice has only been begun to be traversed in recent years. More importantly, there has been a gap between psychodynamic thinking and that of mainstream mental health professionals. To my mind, it is that gap between psychodynamic thinking and mainstream mental health professionals, and not the gap among the various psychoanalytic approaches, that needs to be addressed. And we need to communicate vigorously that psychodynamic thinking has to be part and parcel of all mental health. After all, what do all psychoanalysts do? They listen. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy should be called the listening cure, understanding the subjectivity of the patient. I will end with a quote from Leon Eisenberg, a leading child psychiatrist of the second half of the last century. In 2001, in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Eisenberg describes his 50 years as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. He reports that despite criticisms of some aspects of psychoanalytic ideas and approaches, he regrets his dismissal of psychoanalytic principles. Quote, where Erd was in failing to appreciate the powerful and lasting contribution psychoanalysis made to psychiatry by teaching trainees to listen to patients and to try to understand their distress, rather than merely to classify them by some diagnostic algorithm or snow them with drugs or lock them away or release them to homelessness, unquote. Arnold Richards has been in the forefront of promoting the power of listening to our patients, to our students, and to one another. And to that, we're all grateful. Thank you, Arnie.
And thank you, Leon. Our last presenter is Judith Logue. She has been a practicing psychotherapist, faculty training and supervising psychoanalyst for a half a century. She co-founded the New Jersey Institute for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. She's a former board member of APA Division 39. She's an executive counselor of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Among her other writings is Gaslighting and Beyond, about someone who lives down the road from Arnie named Donald Trump. Judy, your turn.
Thank you, Ken. I'll do my best to tell you in 10 minutes what I think and feel about the memoir of Dr. Arnold Richards, Unorthodox, My Life in and Outside Psychoanalysis and Why. My introduction to his volume 3 of selected papers is titled A Man for All Seasons and describes Arnie as progressive, principled, and persistent. To say that he is passionate, accomplished, and energetic is an understatement. However, today I want to add my quell. Arnie's thesis is that politics determine personal relationships, and personal relationships are affected by politics. Consistent with this thesis, he covers his lived history of psychoanalysis with riveting details and stories about himself and the many analysts who have made our profession what it is today. Arnie has written that personality determines theories, and theories are affected by personality. Like Freud, Arnie thinks in continuums and dualities, not dichotomies. He integrates drive and relational considerations. He is adamant. He refuses to cave to the iron law of oligarchy, whether in theory, practice, politics, or life. He sums up his contemporary conflict theory as different from Heinz Kohut's or the relational psychoanalysts like Stephen Mitchell. He believes they think in dichotomies, not dualities or continuums. He and Arlene stood for integration and against racism. They were members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and spending time with Martin Luther King's right-hand man, Ralph Abernathy, was a meaningful experience. Arlene attended the March Washington speech to hear King in person when Arnie regretfully could not. Members of the uniformed public services are not allowed to participate in partisan political demonstrations. To explain, from 1962 to 1964, Arnie was in Virginia in the public health service at the Petersburg Federal Reformatory. He achieved the rank of lieutenant commander, which is the rank of major in the Army. This satisfied his military obligation under the Berry Plan for physicians. Arnie has changed organizational psychoanalysis and our history. He shares the names, the dates, the disagreements, the backroom stories, and the deals. He tells us what he did to effect change and how he went from being a revered member of the in-group to an ostracized member of the out-group. Hardly an easy shift for the former editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association and a respected and prominent graduate and training analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. Dr. Richards not only writes and teaches, that is, talks the talk, but he walks the walk. He details and describes how he has been politically active, standing against racism and anti-Semitism his entire adult life. We have evidence of this when we read his daily postings on the American Psychoanalytic Association and the Division 39 listservs. Arnie is proud to question conventional thinking and action. He can go beyond the classical and outdated protocol that psychoanalysis requires rigid requirements of furniture and frequency. He invited me as a professional coach and psychoanalyst to share an analytic case with him to help his patient with a specific work issue. Sharing the case in this way was innovative and creative. I saw firsthand, verified by the analyst, how Arnie worked successfully over many years to help this patient save his personal and professional life. For me, it was a gift to collaborate and deepen the treatment, especially when the patient split the transference and temporarily wanted to leave Arnie. What was striking was how easy it was for us to collaborate and interpret, as well as set limits, so both the analysis and the coaching progressed. Co-teaching an advanced continuous case seminar for the Horney Institute, the American Institute for Psychoanalysis, with Arnie further validates how students greatly admire Arnie's knowledgeable, open, and expansive teaching style. Following Erasmus High School graduation in 1951, Arnie graduated early from the University of Chicago in 1952. He completed 2 more years of courses, then went on to graduate in 1958 from Downstate Medical School in Brooklyn. Following an internship at the Public Health Service Marine Hospital in Baltimore, 1959 to 1960, he took a very different direction. Choosing a residency at Menninger School of Psychiatry in Topeka for financial considerations instead of Albert Einstein in the Bronx was an excellent decision. It unexpectedly changed his life forever in ways that encompassed a rich cultural experience and went beyond the professional. Arnie is proud that he thinks and works unconventionally and that he can be direct when necessary and change his mind with new information and experience. No one knows this better than his wife and soulmate of almost 69 years, Dr. Arlene Kramer Richards. She found what she was looking for when she met Arnie, an Orthodox boyfriend who wrapped leather tefillin around his arm like her grandpa. Though Arnie and Arlene still shared their love of Yiddish and Reconstructionist Judaism, psychoanalysis, poetry, theater, opera, movies, and books, orthodoxy did not last long. Following their second date on New Year's Eve, 1952, they decided on New Year's Day they would get married. But on their third or fourth date, says Arlene, I ordered shrimp. I had grown up eating non-kosher food. Arnie tasted the shrimp, and then he ate some more, and that was that. The end of everything. All his religion went kaput. I was astonished, she said. She later learned that it was not so unusual. Arnie's father was not at all religious. For Arnie, the religious thing was his way of being different, said Arlene. It may also have been his way of staying close to his Orthodox mother, for whom he was the most special of her 4 children. She covered their apartment wall with his report cards and awards, and she also made it clear that her son's a blessing. As Arnie writes, my sense is that my almost not being born made me special for my mother, for the rest of my family and beyond. A lot was expected of me, and I was celebrated at every turn. I would like to end where Arnie began. He opens his memoir with the first sentence, I almost didn't get born, which was on August 2nd, 1934. His mother decided to have an abortion, but her older brother, Joe, upon hearing of her intentions, told her she should keep the baby who might grow up to be someone special. I questioned what Arnie thought about the fact that this was a relatively normal discussion in late 1933 or early 1934, unlike today. It was discussed in a matter-of-fact way. This, until I asked, he had not considered it, but he thought I should mention it. This topic fits my personal experience as a Jewish person who was educated also in a matter-of-fact way, that a woman herself decides whether to bring a fetus to term, and that life begins with the first breath. An authoritarian government, the iron law of oligarchy, as Arnie calls it, should not determine forced birth or insemination or sterilization for women or for men. Finally, I would like to especially thank Dr. Ken Fuchsman and Dr. Richards for inviting my participation on the panel today. It's been an honor, privilege, and incredible experience knowing Arnold Richards and his family. I look forward to more years of enlightenment and joy, and wish everyone a healthy and successful year. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And we've had some wonderful presentations. I want to thank each of the 7 presenters for what they've done. We are about 10 minutes behind, but we'll run a little over. Right now, we have a 5-minute break. When we return, there'll be a 20-minute discussion between Arnie and the 7 presenters, starting off with Arnie responding any way he wishes to from what he's heard.
Hello,
Okay,
are we
we're
ready?
ready to begin again. Okay. So we have 20 minutes to have a back and forth between Arnie and the panelists. Arnie, you get to start with whatever you want to say.
Okay, there are two things I want to talk about. First, how did I, why am I so interested or concerned about exclusion? There's an apocryphal story I tell, which may not be true, but I'm always interested in how things began. And the story is, it was 1939. I was 5 years old, and my mother used to take me to the 13th Avenue Market, and the push carts were lined up along the 13th Avenue. And then I remember in 1939 that they opened the 13th Avenue retail market. And my uncle took me to hear Fiorella LaGuardia open the market. And he made a speech. And then my mother took me there the next day, to the Butter and Egg Man and so forth in my stroller. And then when I left, when we went out, there was this lady selling lemons. And I remembered that it made me feel so sad that she wasn't included in the 13th Avenue retail market. And somehow I connect that with my concern about exclusion, which of course has been an interest, a concern about me, whether it's, Arlene from certification or non-physicians from psychoanalysis. It's certainly exclusion has been a very important issue for me, as well as the iron law of oligarchy. So I wanted to add that, to the question that Jim asked, how do I get so interested in exclusion? Also, of course, being Jewish and having a whole history of, 5,000 years of exclusion certainly connects to that. The other thing I wanted to respond to, and it's a very good point about the issue of my attitude, relationship to self-psychology and relational psychoanalysis. The story I like to tell, it was in 1972. Charles Brenner said, we used to have meet every Friday at the Madison's Delicatessen, Arlene and me and Bernie Brodsky and Ernie Kafka and Charlie Brenner. And we would, that's where I continued my psychoanalytic education. And Charlie said to me, there's this friend I know who wrote a book, and of course it was Heinz Kohut, The Analysis of the Self. Why don't you read it and let me know if there's anything in it worthwhile? And so I did, and then proceeded, to write a whole series of critiques about self-psychology and self-psychology. And my critique is that I had a problem with with view. The main, again, my important paper was self-theory, conflict theory, and the problem of hypochondriasis. The difference between self-theory and conflict theory, because I thought that conflict was essential to psychoanalytic theory. But I should add, although I was critical of self-psychology, one of my best friends became Arnie Goldberg. And I think eventually his view of his criticism of self-psychology was very similar to mine. And my problem with Mitchell, that's a whole other story, but I certainly remained close to Jay Greenberg. And in fact, I published his paper on relational excesses, I guess in JAPA, whereas the relational journal would not publish it. And finally, my problem with relational psychoanalysis, as I and Janet Bouchant and Arlene and Art Lynch have written, is there's a problem with dichotomy. The idea that it's either the drive or relational dichotomy is something I have a problem with, because my sense is that's not what Freud had in mind, And in group psychology and the analysis of ego, he has a quote which says very, very definitively that it's always drive and object, not one or the other. So maybe that answers some of the question. But one final thing, and I agreed with Lou Aaron that there were some aspects, of relational psychoanalysis were primarily politically motivated. That Steve Mitchell wanted to start a movement that those who were excluded from the American Psychoanalytic Association, like himself, could belong to. And of course, you know, Jay Greenberg accepted honorary membership in the American Psychoanalytic Association, but Steve Mitchell did not. So that, I think, covers some of the things, but remind me of other questions you have that I should respond to.
Well, let's start, since it was Jim Anderson's question that you are responding to initially, at least initially. Let's see if Jim has something he wants to say back.
Well, my question is really about your personality. We're a lot of psychoanalysts here, and we know that positions don't completely come from intellectual differences, but
Right.
personalities are central. So there's something about you that wants to be exclusive. I can only guess at a little bit of it. Partly your being a favorite son had something to do with a certain kind of confidence you had. You readily accepted it when the in-group included you with them. Like, oh, this is natural. Of course, people are always going to do this with me. That just seemed to come naturally to you. And then
Well, a simple explanation is.
Let me
why
go
I'm
on a
so-
little bit more. Let me go on a little bit more.
Oh, sorry.
And then also when you started to have differences with them and others, you sort of think, oh, I can talk about that. Everybody always accepts me. They'll be fine with that. And maybe you were a little bit surprised that they started excluding you then.
Well, you know, certainly the fact that I'm so concerned about people being excluded may come from a sense of guilt about my own background and my own sister.
Ah.
So, and that may be why I go out of my way to, you know, for people not to be excluded, because, you know, my situation in the family was that I was included, and my being included necessitated others being included. But my sister, to this day, insists that it never really bothered her that I was the favorite, and she wasn't, you know, didn't have that same position. In fact, she even insists that she was very proud of me and participated in my success, just as my mother and father did.
Daniel, do you have anything you want to say or ask?
Not just yet. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Jimmy.
Arnie, we need a little bit more of Mac the Knife this afternoon. Where's
Yes.
Mac the Knife?
That's a very good question. Yes, yes. You know, so after Charlie asked me to review cohorts, I then proceeded to write a whole series of reviews, you know, of psychoanalysts very critically, and whether it was John Ghetto and Tony Chris and a whole bunch of reviews. They were all critical. And that's Arlene, who called me Mac the Knife? Was that you or Arlene? Huh?
Yeah.
It was you?
Yeah.
Arlene says she made up the term.
Oh, she must
Mac-
know.
Mac the Knife. And, you know, look, the fact is that when you're writing, you know, to be critical, it's much easier to be critical sometimes than to be supportive, right? And that drives, I think what we're talking about is what drives the effort, the critical effort. And the more critically you come, the more you have something to say. And if you can distinguish your views from someone else's views, you know, that was the name of the game, right? So I think
Arnie, when Brenner said to you, please read this and tell me if it's worthwhile, why didn't you suggest to him that he read it for himself and make his own determination?
Well, that's not what I would say to Brenner, you know, at that stage of my life. You know, Brenner was like a god for all of us, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and he welcome that position. He
I
did
bet he
not
did. Yeah.
tolerate. No, he was very interesting. He certainly did not tolerate disagreement from his peers. He tolerated more disagreement from people who are not his peers. But when Arlene developed some radical ideas about female psychology, and she told it to him, he said to her, "Okay, find the evidence, write about it." But I don't think if that was a senior female, he would have said the same thing. What do you think, Arlene?
I think he had a dedication to bringing along the young.
Yeah, Arlene just said he had a dedication to bring along the young, but I would say, but the young would be his acolytes, Arlene.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
He treated me as if I were someone who is entitled to have ideas also.
Yes.
And I think he asked you to do that book review because he wanted your ideas.
Yeah, but I think Arlene is right. He genuinely was interested, in my opinion. And so I guess that's the way I took it.
Henry, do you have something you want to ask or say to Arnie?
No, well, Arnie, I wonder whether you feel in some way you never did reach Steve Mitchell or Heinz Kohut, because it seems to me your dedication to drive theory and to Freud's original definition may have blocked you from seeing where they were going. I had dinner with Jay Greenberg last night, and he was talking about what he saw as the drift in editorial policy. And I asked him, well, didn't you have conflict with Arnie Richards? He said, no, I really would yearn for Arnie to be back doing that because he did it so well. But Steve never could reconcile.
Well, let me tell you a story that's relevant to that. Todd Essig organized a for-money seminar with Steve Mitchell. You could sign up and he would talk and you would listen. So when I heard about it, I said, oh, that's wonderful. I'd like to join. So I signed up, I sent him my money, and then, Todd calls me up and says, no, you can't come. Steve won't let you participate. And I said, what? He said it would make him too nervous. So I said, okay, I will participate, but I won't say anything. And Tad said, no, it can't happen. So they gave me my money back. And so Jay is right. For some reason, Steve could not tolerate criticism from me and his group, which I refer, as the relational mafia. I was the enemy and the pure and simple. So I'm very glad that Jay said that, because I think it's true. And Jay and Steve were very different. And as I said, I published Jay's paper when Dialogues would not.
Well, because his paper was hostile in some way to the relational group. See, what I'm trying to get at is a way in which fundamentally, you talk about being open, but never really grasping why the way in which you criticized was not just criticism, that it was dismissive of something that they were saying, which they felt, like Kohut felt, would change the way in which patients were treated. I know when I wrote this article on anonymity, the problem with anonymity, you said to me, well, everybody has already changed. And as I said to you, no, they haven't. I don't think so. I really want you to publish it. You haven't yet. But the point is that I think there's ways in which some of us have wanted to change that we felt you didn't grasp, that we felt you...
Well, look, I'm aware of that. All I can say is I've been trying to do just that. I've been trying to reconsider my views about relational psychoanalysis and self-psychology. And I've been certainly I had conversations, with Arnie Goldberg along those lines, and with other
Let me
people
tell
as
you
well.
Hold
Arnie,
on. Henry, I want to give everybody who's on the panel a chance, and we only have.
Okay, go ahead, continue. Go
So
ahead.
the next would be Jane. Do you have anything you want to say to your dear friend Arnie?
She's written a great book. Everyone should buy it.
Go ahead, Jane.
I can't tell you how welcoming he was to me and Jim and then me, and how I think that overrides everything that everybody's talking about, that he is genuinely enthusiastic about hearing other voices. And I really appreciate that so much. And I'm so thrilled, Arnie, that you invited me to talk on this panel, because I just love you. I mean, I love that spirit about you, and I wish more people would emulate. And I think people are emulating that, because it's very refreshing in this field. It's just that almost died and may still die someday. I don't know, but you are breathing life into it, and you always have. So thank you. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Leon.
I'll just say one thing, that little discussion between Henry and Arnie and Arlene's comment about Charlie Brenner really indicates the problem that psychoanalysis struggles with. All these disagreements, all these different theories, as I tried to say, are based on people's charismatic leader taking over and then saying, this is the way to do things. And then you develop a group, and then you have all these various groups, rather than really trying to find a way of addressing competing theories. And are these competing theories anything more than epiphenomena? Basically, there are some very basic principles of psychoanalysis, which I think all analysts have. And I think that all these arguments, this theory versus that theory, integrating, not integrating, are really epiphenomena, which are really of secondary importance and of no interest to the rest of the mental health world.
I once said that in terms of what the issue of becoming a training analyst has to do with whose dinner party you get invited to. So there is this guild, this cult, this club aspect, and that brings up, determinants that supersede the issues.
Judy, you're the last speaker.
I want to be brief because we need time for discussion, but I want to thank you, Jane, for bringing up the future of psychoanalytic education because that's when I met Arnie and you did a masterful job, and we did the whole finale, and it was very inclusive, but it's a special memory because that's when I met you and Arnie. So,
Great.
But it really was quite something. So I just wanted to highlight that, because we had 11 leaders of the major psychoanalytic organizations allowed to speak 10 minutes at the end. And it was quite an event.
Thank you.
Ken?
Arnie, you want to have any last word?
No, I like to hear from everyone else.
Okay, so we're
Ken?
now
Ken?
going to have a half hour of
Ken?
people from the audience asking questions. Someone's saying something to me?
Ken?
Yes?
Can I make my comment?
Uh,
Daniel here.
Okay, Daniel. All right.
Yes.
Of course, you can make your comment.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that when I first heard that Arnie was going to work on this memoir, I was bug-eyed excited because, as I like to put it, psychoanalysis is a human tradition passed from one generation to the next. And we can see the parade of figures throughout the history of psychoanalysis. And Arnie is one of those people who is standing on the shoulders of some giants, who stood on the shoulders of the analysts in Vienna and all the way back to Freud. And so when I heard that he was going to write this memoir, I thought, oh, we need this. Not many people are able to grab a hold of their historical moment and narrate it. And so I'm really, really grateful to Arnie for having the courage to sit down and put all this down in print. And I thank you very much.
And I cherish your support and your introduction. Thank you.
And we all thank you, Arnie, for putting this down. So the first of the speakers from the audience or questions is Arlene Heyman. So if you want to speak yourself, unmute yourself and talk to whomever.
Hi, I'm Arlene Heyman. I'm a physician. I'm a graduate of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. And I'm the writer of 2 works of fiction, Scary Old Sex, which is a series of short stories, and Artifact, which is a novel. They're put out by Bloomsbury. I want to say this has been a wonderful afternoon. It's been a pleasure to listen to hear Arnie talk at length is always a joy. Then the different speakers, you get to know people by how they talk about Arnie. So that's been very enlightening also. I want to answer a couple of questions that Arnie raised. One, he says that he's not getting so many psychoanalytic books, that his bestsellers at the American were one book about Jane Austen, and I can't recall the name of the other book, but it was also not
Sinatra.
I'm sorry?
Sinatra.
Oh, about Frank Sinatra. Okay. So my guess, because I don't have the statistics at my hand, is that Arnie is one of the few people who will publish novels, who will publish poetry, who will publish books that are not on psychoanalytic subjects. I don't think many of the other psychoanalytic presses will do that. Therefore, I think he is selling more of those. And it might be for other psychoanalytic books, people are going elsewhere. They can't get what Arnie's giving elsewhere. Second, a comment about Arnie's parents not realizing they should try to get the money together to get him into Harvard. His parents didn't know anything. And I just want to comment, mine didn't either, that at the time I went up there, it was Radcliffe for women, Harvard for men. And I met with my parents and my sister, some guy in the Harvard yard who said, you don't want to go here. All the women who go here, they're ugly and they never get married. So that was it for me. I never applied to Radcliffe. I took his word for it. I'm just saying your parents were not much more into it than my parents were. And many of us who have become psychoanalysts come out of families who don't know what they have a general idea education is good, but they don't know one school from another.
They were immigrants.
Exactly. My parents were first generation, but one of them grew up speaking no English. So they were practically immigrants, mine, same generation. Then I wanted to ask you, who was your analyst?
Henry Lowenfeld.
Henry Lowenfeld.
Lowenfeld,
Okay.
yes. He was very well respected at the New York Psychoanalytic. I think he ran the treatment center for a while with his wife, Yella, or maybe not, maybe that's the correct. And he was a member of the Freudian left, you know, with Fenikel and Reich and those people, and Edith Jacobson and Elizabeth Lantos. That's who he was. And he left Germany. He left Germany in 1932. And I spoke to his son because he said when they drove from Berlin from Berlin to Prague to escape the Nazis, they had a Volkswagen with a bumper sticker saying "Juden sind unser Unglück." Jews are our, disaster. And they had that on their car, and they got to Prague. He was very close to Otto Fenikel, and that's who he was. And he was a very nice analyst, or I think so. But as I said, I would have liked to have more of a relationship with him. But I have spoken to his son, Andreas, who is a very distinguished lawyer. Go ahead.
So
Our next questioner is Mac Runyon. Mac, and if there's more time, Arlene, we'll come back to you at the end.
that's fine.
You ready, Mac?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thanks. I really appreciate this meeting today. It's incredibly useful for me. I'm a former professor at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm interested in the history of psychology, and I've got only a partial relationship to psychoanalysis. In my view, it's one of the major theories of personality in a way. That's the angle I come at it from, reading Hall and Lindsay, 1957, theories of personality. They've got like 12 different chapters. One of them is psychoanalysis. And then, and then later years, they did later volumes of this, and it boils down to like 4 major approaches to psychology: psychoanalysis and psychodynamic approaches. Then there's experimental approaches, from ending in B.F. Skinner and behaviorism. Then there's humanistic psychology with Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow. And I can't remember if they have biological psychology as a major one, but that becomes a major one. And my question is, how do these different versions of psychology compete with each other? And I'll give you one extreme example. I graduated from Harvard in 1975, a program in clinical psychology and public practice, which I loved the program. It only lasted 4 years. It was too controversial. It got closed down. But when I have sabbaticals, I go to Harvard, and I find it fascinating, all the stuff that's going on. I went to one introductory psychology class a bunch of years ago, and the guy teaching the class was a psychologist. He said, psychoanalysis is not scientific. I'm not going to talk about psychoanalysis. I'm not going to answer any questions about psychoanalysis. Let's go on. We're studying scientific psychology. And he had his conception of it. And that's meaningful to me because in a more minor way, in my own life, I've sort of struggled with some of this. I'm interested in the study of life histories, individual lives, and in psychobiography. And I thank Paul Elovitz for inviting me to contribute to his book, The Many Roads of the Builders of Psychohistory. And there I briefly tell my own story, being a professor at UC Berkeley, what worked, what didn't work. And I was surprised at Berkeley, there was a strand of support for this, the kind of stuff I did, studying individual life histories, but also there's significant opposition. And I go into some of that. I won't summarize that now, but I guess I want to say, I really love this thing today, and if I was still teaching, I taught at Berkeley for 31 years, then I retired in 2010. But if I was still teaching, I would assign a version of this whole thing today. And it's a fascinating example of the
that's very nice
connection between different groups within psychoanalysis and how they work things out or not work things out. And I really look forward to reading this memoir, which I have not read yet, but my whole interest is in the relationship of a biography to the history of science in a way.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Do you have any other response? Do you have any other response, Arnie, to what Mac has been saying? Or you also?
No, just the fact is that there are very few graduate schools in psychology that are analytically oriented now, and that's too bad.
Why is that?
So, Sandra, we have 4 more people to do, and we have.
Good. So let's go for it.
Sandra Buckler, you are the next person.
Wonderful.
Hi, Arnie. I'm Sandra Buchel from the William Melanson White Institute. I want to first thank you for the Mount Sinai conferences, which were very important in my own thinking and development, and had that spirit of coming together for people from different theoretical backgrounds. And I just wanted to say, sort of a plug for all that we have in common rather than our differences, including a lot of values that are so important today. A book that is in my mind since I read it is the title is The Death of Truth. And I think it's such a significant aspect of the world we're in, that the truth is not valued for itself and cherished in so many places as it had been. And what your spirit, Arnie, represents to me more than anything else is the willingness to go wherever the truth leads you. And I think we have to appreciate how much psychoanalysts of various theoretical backgrounds have in common in valuing the truth for itself. Thank you.
Just very quickly, the Sinai thing was begun by Owen Rennick, myself, and David Tuckett, the three journals, the Quarterly, the IPA and JAPA. And then I said, well, what about contemporary? And David Tuckett said, what's that? And what about William Alston White? And David Tuckett said, who are they? But Owen and I insisted that contemporary would be included, and the rest is history. And there's a long history that followed that. It's a very significant thing that we did. Okay.
Okay, so we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more people and 19 minutes. So Claire Steinberger, turn on your mic.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, Arnie. It's a trip back home, and I miss everybody with the pandemic, and it's been wonderful knowing you all of these years and contributing in my own way to the IP books and whatnot. So, and this is a marvelous afternoon, I agree. So my question and comment was really having to do with systems. And I was asking you, when you talk about the psychoanalytic work, is it system, an organizational system? How do we make room? Will there always be a tension, an inevitable tension between being open and inclusive and growth in that way, and then holding on to what becomes a kind of core, the holding on to what is static, or we can call it the core. And that's, for me, understanding the inevitable tension in systems over time. And I'm just throwing that out. I remember studying at NPAP and having along this line, and having a teacher who was very much into classical analytic theory, a wonderful teacher, by the way. I still love her to this day. And I was reading Roy Schaefer. And I remember her saying, Roy Schaefer, he's not a real analyst. And that was at the time when he was writing the New Language for Psychoanalysis. And I guess it was a little less drive and more on his ideas of narrative and whatnot. So there was always this kind of tension as you move on and you take in more ideas and whatnot, and those that will hold on. And I'm very interested just in that kind of the movement of systems, and that's where I'm going.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is to make the clinical theory, and if you want to say the facts, the data, be the final arbiter as much as possible. And that's what needs to be done. Go ahead.
Okay, well, we move on to the next person, which is Penny Rosen.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add than what I had written in the chat. Thank you, Arnie, for presentation. I just, in terms of you being so sensitive to exclusion, my plea is that not to exclude at this point self-psychology, because I think it's hard to look at it through a Freudian lens, but it definitely has value in terms of understanding man, woman, people. So that's all. I don't have much more to say. I see there are other
I'm all
people.
for including it, but I would
Okay.
comment that it seems to be being included less in Chicago than before. And we have to wonder about that and how that came about, because that was where it all began. And I think, well, anyway, there's a lot that
It's a long discussion.
a long discussion. Go ahead, next.
Jack Novick is next. Go ahead, Jack. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. At the bottom left, you'll see something that you can unmute. It'll say mute. On the bottom left of the screen.
Hover over with your mouse on the left lower corner of the screen.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Jack. You'll figure it out and we'll come back to you.
Good, next.
Carolyn Ellman.
Oh.
Now you're unmuted.
Okay, Jack's now unmuted. You can go ahead.
Okay, just Arnie, it was a fantastic afternoon and well worth it. I'm looking forward to reading your biography.
Memoir.
Your autobiography, we do share so many things, including the year we were born, including a love for your wife, Arlene, different kind of love, but I do love her. And but I was surprised to find that you had polio as a child. Can you talk all about that and how it may have affected you and your later thinking?
Say about yourself.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked that up. Well, so the way it happened, I mean, I went to Camp Wilmette and I got polio and I ended up in the hospital and this was 48. And what I remember about it was the election, Truman, Dewey, and Wallace. And that was a big concern. And so I watched the Progressive Party convention and but I sort of was rooting for Truman anyway, and well, it had a profound effect because of my polio. I got to go to Erasmus and not New Utrecht, and that was a very important. But I was very lucky. It was non-paralytic, and I didn't have much of a disability. So. But it's something that I share with people, and then it's sort of the problem with it coming back. So you had polio. Yeah, good. In 48, a lot of people had polio. Go ahead.
You still have to unmute yourself again, Jack. Okay.
Next,
All
Carolyn.
right, next is Carolyn.
Steve.
Well, it's Carolyn with a slightly deeper voice.
Yes.
This must be Stephen then.
That's correct.
All right, Stephen.
Yes.
Can you do your best Carolyn imitation, or are you going to do your own talk?
No, I'm going to try to remind Arnie about a couple of things.
Good.
That he, first of all, that first meeting that you talked about with, you, Owen, and Tuckett, I was there as well. So was Carolyn.
I'd forgotten that, but
yeah,
good to remember.
Steve Mitchell and I were the first discussants of the whole.
Correct. Yes.
Of the whole thing. So, unfortunately, I was just becoming friendly with Steve, and he died.
Right.
Shortly, not too long after that. But what I remember is the big argument that you and I had was when I was criticizing New York Psychoanalytic.
Yes.
Strongly defended New York Psychoanalytic. It's good to see that you've moved way past that position.
Correct.
So in my book, When Theories Touch, I try to bring together a variety of things and look at your papers with Bashant and others to try to show how there are some ways that those things touch. But it's been a lot of fun hearing your past, which I knew a reasonable amount about. And it's been a lot of fun hearing the ways that you have moved through your career. So thank
Do you know, when I became editor, I think I mentioned this, the institute that had the most papers accepted that first year was IPTAR.
IPTAR, as I left New York Psychoanalytic and graduated from IPTAR.
I know, that's why I mentioned it.
Arnie, I went to Erasmus, so we have that.
Right, yes, you went to Erasmus. as I
Carolyn
did
went to
Arlene.
Erasmus, and you might have done even better if you would have gone to Midwood.
Well, no, because I wouldn't have met, the people I met at Erasmus. But people in my family went to Midwood. They lived in
Anyway,
Midwood.
congratulations, Arnie.
Yes. Anyway,
Okay.
thank you.
So we're going to
Next.
check with the next person, Susan Cavalier Adler, to see which high school she went to. So Susan, it's your turn. So come on and unmute yourself when you're ready.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I wanted to respond to Arnie's opening comment about what books are being sold and not. I mean, my first two books were all psychobiography, The Compulsion to Create, Women Writers, Their Demon Lovers, and the Creative Mystique from Red Shoes, Frenzy to Love and Creativity. Then I had my, a number of, I've had 7 books now, and a number of clinical books with Anatomy of Regret, The Klein Winnicott Dialectic, Morning Spirituality, and Psychic Change.
Yeah.
Now I just came out with, through Arnie's IP books with.
Yes, they're excellent books and wonderful covers. We are going to promote them very vigorously.
Great.
Yeah, we will.
I just wanted to say, though, it's all clinical. You're saying nobody wants to read it anymore.
Well, we're going to try. You have to recognize the problem that you can deal with. So we have to find ways to do just that. And I think we will.
Okay, I just want to say the name of the book if I can.
Yeah, of course.
Developmental Mourning, Erotic Transference, and Object Relations Psychoanalysis. I'm also the founder and executive director of the Object Relations Institute for Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, which has been around for 32 years.
Yes, you've done a major contribution to our field. Next.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Nancy Goodman.
We have a note from Nancy Goodman. Okay, I have 2 notes. Penny Rosen says, you know who else went to Erasmus? Eric Kandel.
I know that. We knew each other. We absolutely knew each other, yes.
Sandy Koufax. Don't forget Sandy Koufax.
Right.
He's now an analyst, right? No. Okay. Nancy Goodman asks, Arnie, where are you leading us next?
First, well, I have to, where next? I have to finish the book, and it's very close to being finished. My editor has interviewed our children with some very interesting that is going to be included. I think the next, my next effort is on the new journal, the International Journal of Controversial Discussions. The last one, I think, is one of the most important books I've published. It's Jew Hatred, the Black Milk of Civilization. The next one is on Dreams, edited by Arlene, based on a paper of Eugene Mann. We're planning an issue devoted to Jane Hall's, maybe a chapter from her book. And so that's certainly, I'm going to try and stress that. And just very quickly, there's just, I might add, the papers that I am the proudest of. One is Doorpost, which was in your book, on witnessing, which I think is a very important paper. And also my paper on immortality, seeing people in dreams that are alive, that are dead. And that's in one of my selected paper volumes. And I'll have to find, I don't know, I'm sure I'll find stuff to do. What about you?
I'm going to leave people with a song, which is when I wrote an appreciation for Arnie, I remembered the song, I Will Follow You Wherever You May Go, which is a really catchy tune. So I leave people with that to think about Arnie leading us onward.
Right.
Okay.
Good. Hello, Lou.
Hey, Arnie.
Hello.
Great to see
Can't
you.
wait for the season to start.
I know, we're going to have a 7-pitcher rotation, and maybe everyone on the screen can become Giants fans like you and me, so they can root for our team and engage with us every day with an email about the Giants.
Excellent, excellent. Ken, anyone else? Ken?
Ken, you're muted.
All the people I've met in New York City, they're all sports fans, males that is, except one who grew up on East 79th Street. But okay, Jim Anderson says if Arnie had gone to Midwood, he might have met Woody Allen.
Correct. Yeah. But Woody Allen went to the Yeshiva of Flatbush before that.
How come so little references to the Bronx High School of Science?
What?
How come so little emphasis to science, the Bronx High School of Science, where I went and many other people went?
Right, right. And right. So who would you say? We met Woody Allen at parties through a friend of ours, Jerry Epstein. That's a whole other connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the person whose organization is sponsoring this event, Paul Olovitz, wrote something. Do you want to say anything, Paul?
Yes, please.
Well, if sometimes Paul has to leave. Okay, you're all set, Paul?
No, I'm here.
Okay, go.
If you want daily doses of Arnie, he's on Psychohistory Forum's Clio Psyche Google listserv, sending poems, sending advertisements for his books, sending different things. My only complaint is that he doesn't do things at enough length, because he has interesting things to say. So that would be very nice.
Yeah, well, look, Paul, I was famous for that. In college, I would write a paper, 3 paragraphs, and get an A. And so I haven't changed that tendency. But you're absolutely
send
right.
3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
Because you're simply sending links.
Right, I know.
Paragraphs, so we can get more from your wisdom.
Okay, I'm trying. I'm trying.
It's nice to have you there. Besides
Good.
the arguments
But
that
thank
we
you.
made,
Thank you. You've done a great job.
Okay, so Judith Mark says mostly to everyone, mostly to Arnold, no books or papers, only love, perhaps from Richard too. And Arlene Heyman says she'd like to know what you remember of your analysis and to tell us about an experience with a patient you're most proud of.
Okay, well, there's no time for that now. Well, let me just say what comes to mind right off. Kurt Eisler, do you remember him?
Yeah.
He sent me a paper to treat. And the thing about Kurt, he would send you patients and expect that you not charge them. So I treated this person for nothing, for several years, and she did very well. And after she died, she left me money in her legacy.
How about that?
And I was very touched by that. And well, and it just along those lines, what comes to mind is I've had patients one patient comes to mind that I started treating when she was in college, medical school, residency, marriage, children. I have connected with her, for maybe 40 years. And every year, Rosh Hashanah, she gets in touch with me. And so it's like, it's like contributed to a life. And I think that's what makes what we do the most rewarding. and everything else is commentary. The impact we can have on people as analysts, as therapists, is really what makes it all worthwhile and makes all the stuff we do worthwhile.
Arnie, that seems to be the best last words, except that I will add that again, Arnie's memoir, you can pre-order it.
Right.
And I want to thank Arnie, Arlene, Paul, Ina, and everybody who presented and attended for this wonderful day, and we hope to do more.